My name's Caitlin Byrne. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute here in Brisbane, Queensland, where I'm joining you from, and also really delighted to be able to join you as a faculty fellow of CPD. I guess in beginning, let me do something that we do traditionally here in Australia, and that is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. Here in Brisbane, I'm on the land of Turrbal and Jagera peoples. I acknowledge those traditional owners and I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and indeed to all Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples around the world and joining us on this virtual platform today. So it is a great pleasure to be joining you for this conversation around accountability in national security policy. And a huge pleasure for me to be able to welcome our speaker, Michael Mazarr, to take the floor in just a moment to speak on his book, Leap of Faith, which really speaks to the issues of hubris, negligence, and America's greatest foreign policy tragedy. Michael is joining us as a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, but of course, previously he brings an enormous wealth of expertise and experience to this topic, and previously was with the US National War College, where he was professor and associate dean of academics, and I know that his bio will be shared with you also in the chat space. But one of the things I think is really unique about the expertise that Michael brings is that he's really been, I think, looked at national security within the US and its development, design and delivery from a number of different perspectives, including academia, but also having been a senior defence aide in the Capitol as well. So look, without further ado, let me introduce Michael. Michael will speak for about 20 minutes and then we'll have an opportunity to get into questions. As Stacey mentioned, please think about your questions, enter them in the chat. We hope this can be a really interactive discussion around the ideas of accountability in national security policy. So Michael, over to you.
Thanks very much, Caitlin, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all here today to talk about an issue that I think is extremely important and doesn't necessarily get a lot of, typically get a lot of attention in thinking about national security policy, and that is the issue of the accountability and responsibility of senior officials for the actions that they take. I should note that the remarks I'm going to make today are my own views. They're my personal views. I wrote this book, Leap of Faith, on my own time. This is not, RAND isn't responsible for what I say today, and this particular project isn't part of RAND's research agenda. The whole book, Leap of Faith, is a case study basically of the US decision to go to war in Iraq, how to understand it, what it says about US foreign policy. We can talk about all of that in the Q&A, and it's based on over 100 interviews with participants and all the declassified documents I was able to find. But the issue that I wanted to focus on in this session was this question of accountability, which I get to at the end of the book, because it is obviously the story of a tragedy. It's the story of a disaster and a decision poorly made. And one of the questions that it raises is, in the same way that we hold senior executives in other parts of our society accountable for their actions, how can we or should we hold senior national security officials accountable for these kinds of things? I actually think the issue of accountability is a really timely question. To me, a big part of the story of the last couple of decades in the United States and more broadly is the series of terrible misjudgments that have left the United States less well off, less secure, weaker, more unstable, not only decisions like Iraq, but a lot of the decisions in the financial industry that led to the financial crisis, other irresponsible actions of corporate leaders, financial speculators, actions of some senior US officials over the last number of years, a whole range of things that I think have led people to question whether our system is accountable at all, and to whom. There's a sense, I think a growing sense in our society, that there are these vast social institutions that have no need or impulse to be responsive to us as individuals, whether it's corporate leaders who walk away with big settlements when they get tossed out of an organization, or even sports stars and coaches who come back into their professions fairly quickly because their talent overrides whatever accountability they face for misjudgments, criminal action, whatever it might be. I think there's an argument that the most fundamental kind of inequality that's growing in our society is not really wealth or opportunity, but a fundamental division between some people in society who are accountable to their actions and others who are not. And beyond that kind of societal risk, there's the question for governance, for the future of democracy. If a political system, I think, comes to a point where people don't think it is accountable anymore, legitimacy will suffer, and there'll be an issue for the future of that society. So that's a big issue. However, it's possible that we still might say, despite the fact that we're concerned about accountability and we want to increase accountability, that in the realm of politics, or particularly national security policy, it's a different thing. That in the realm of governance, elections are the basic mechanism of accountability, right? If there's a senior national security crew that you don't like, you vote out, in the United States, the president, you vote out their party, and that is where accountability arrives. And so there's a question of whether we really need to go beyond that. Shouldn't we essentially leave it at that, public accountability through elections, and really not focus on the behavior or actions of particular groups or individuals in government, unless, of course, they do something outright illegal, right? On the other hand, elections are a very crude tool of accountability. We may still want to vote for a particular president, even though they or some of their senior officials have led the country into tragedies. There's a lot of different reasons why people will pick one side or another. And I do think that it ought to make us uncomfortable that the reality is that senior officials in government can essentially contribute to the decision process in whatever ways they do and face no particular ramifications. Now, certainly in some cases, they'll have a reputational hit, or they may not be in line for the same kind of board memberships when they come out. There may be critical articles written about them, and maybe we consider that enough. But in the case of Iraq, I think it does raise a bigger question of whether that's enough, and what we need to do to hold people accountable. Because in the case of Iraq, you've got a disaster, and a preventable one, right? Not just from the fact that they took the wrong decision. And as I'll say, you can believe even that invading Iraq was the right thing to do and still believe that the decision process was managed in such an incoherent way that somebody needs to face some consequences for that. So that's the question, is do we believe that senior government officials, and I'm talking particularly in national security, but of course the question could be asked in other fields, should be held accountable for the decisions that they make? So I'm just going to read a short quote here from a legal essay on criminal negligence, which has inspired some of my thinking on this in a business setting, that said the following about a number of major disasters that happened. If one considers carefully the chain of events that led up to any of the well-known industrial disasters, Bhopal, thalidomide, Dalkon Shield, the asbestos deaths at Manville Corporation, or any other, one cannot fail to be struck by the fact that the loss of lives and the human suffering that ensued were in each instance directly and primarily attributable to what a series of corporate functionaries did or failed to do. Numerous individuals within the corporation acted repeatedly in ways that can only be called callous and criminally negligent. The basic cause of each of these disasters lay not in the failure of technical systems, but in the failure of individuals, and particularly the top management, including the CEO and board of directors, to act with due care and a sufficient sense of responsibility. Can we say in a similar way that based on the evidence of what is known about the Iraq case and others in American history, that a good part of the failure was, quote, directly and primarily attributable to what a series of government officials did or failed to do? And that some officials in the Bush administration acted repeatedly in ways that can only be called callous and criminally negligent? Certainly some of my interviewees said that about folks that were in government at the time. So there's at least a theoretical possibility of thinking about the problem of negligence and accountability and responsibility for national security decisions. But as soon as we start thinking about that in a theoretical way, a lot of practical complications emerge. One is about motives and beliefs. So in the business realm, in some of those disasters, you could have somebody who knew, for example, that a given product they were making was poisonous, that it was harming people. They actively covered that up, right? That's a clear violation of law, clear criminal negligence. On the national security side, I would say 99% of senior national security officials absolutely believe that what they are advocating is the best answer for the country. They do not believe they are hiding anything, covering anything up. They don't believe that they are, midwifing a disaster and trying to conceal it. They think what they're doing is right. And given that, and if a mistake is, caused by the lack of information, is that something that we can really hold them accountable for? A second problem is causality. So what do you do with well-intentioned people that make a reasonable decision, which then goes bad for reasons beyond their control? Had the bin Laden raid gone sour, for example, had a lot of Americans and Pakistanis been killed, would we blame senior officials of the Obama administration for this tragedy, even though, let's presume that the reasons why it failed were things that happened after the decision that are out of their control? And there's some aspect of this to all big national security decisions, in particular decisions to go to war. This inherent complexity, the presence of so many different variables that makes this, in the end, really a very subjective judgment call. So how are you going to hold somebody responsible for that? If they make the wrong judgment call, but they believe that it was the right one, they haven't arguably done anything wrong. I think that's true, but we can still have standards of accountability, as I'll talk about. So how do we get in the direction of possibly thinking about accountability? If we think it's important, if we think the absence of it is not a good thing for a democracy, but there are these very practical concerns of starting to blame people for things that were the best judgment they could have made at the time. I think we can approach this in a few ways with kind of the beginnings of some criteria. So one distinction we have to make is between issues on which there's just a basic, simple disagreement over policy. Should we withdraw from Afghanistan today or not? And arguments on both sides that are equipped with various information, and you're really making a guess, in effect, versus actions that reflect an inappropriate or incompetent performance of a role, of a senior national security role, which contributed decisively to disaster. So are they performing their role effectively, appropriately? We also have to make a distinction between what's known and what's not known at the time. You can't very well come in and say, well, if they'd known something that they found out later. So we can only judge these things by what these officials, the information they have at the time, what they can do with it. So it starts to edge in the direction of an argument that I would say, for example, accountability applies to choices and actions given what is known at the time, and given the degree to which a decision maker performs their duty in a manner sufficient to meet the responsibility they have in their position. So we can begin to define that. Still begs a lot of questions about how do you measure that, but you can begin to define that. So in the book, I looked into the legal writings on negligence and criminal negligence to just get some clues. Not that I think the word criminal is really that relevant. I'm not at all talking about putting people in jail for these things, because we're not talking about violations of law. But it gives some hints about how we can define what is negligent behavior, what is objectively an insufficient performing of a duty. So at the core of criminal negligence is this idea of a failure to meet an established obligation to some person or group, right? So an auto manufacturer that knows their brakes are faulty, but goes ahead and manufactures the cars is behaving negligently. And the key phrase is duty of care, right? These are actors that are being judged, decision makers who have a duty of care to some set of people, their customers, whoever. And the legal negligence standard is, would a responsible person see this standard as applying? So this is really the heart of my argument about accountability and national security, is especially when making decisions about peace and war. I think it's obvious that senior national security officials have a duty of care to the citizens of their country, to the military service members whose lives they're going to place at risk, to the citizens of the country they're going to invade or involve in the war, to the wider world community. Those stakeholders clearly represent areas of a duty of care of senior national security officials. And I don't think that it's necessarily any less concrete or enforceable than the duty of care that the CEO of a tobacco company or an auto manufacturer or an oil company would have to customers and communities, right? The trick, though, becomes how do you assess whether that duty is met? And in the negligence, there are certain legal standards, of course, and then there's this responsible person standard. In national security, it gets a little cloudier. And as I said, I don't think it can be judged by whether the choice is right, because at the time you make them, in just about all significant national security decisions, you don't know whether it's the right decision. So I think the standard has to be more about process than substance. Does the national security team demonstrate its duty of care in the way in which it makes a decision and the way in which those individuals play the roles assigned to them in that process? So in the book, I developed this idea of policy negligence based on 4 criteria that are a combination of things from the legal negligence standard, but mostly from decision-making literature. What makes for good and effective and responsible decision-making? And I suggest 4 criteria. Number 1, do the senior decision makers carefully interrogate the rationale for a proposed action? Do they know why they're doing it? Do they debate whether it is an issue of necessity? Do they know why they're doing this action? Number 2, do they thoroughly and rigorously process and assess all information relevant to the decision? Do they assure themselves they have all the information they need? Do they debate it and process it? Do they question it? Third, do they rigorously consider all potential risks and then work to mitigate them? And then fourth, do they structure and manage the debate to get the best possible decision? That is, they don't punish dissent, they encourage all people to express their views and so on. So even in those 4 areas, an immediate question arises of, well, how do you know good enough? And I admit that it is difficult potentially to identify a clear threshold where responsible action turns into negligence about how you structure and manage the debate or whether you consider all the risks. But there's still some extremes I think we can identify. And I think we can find some cases in which those standards were clearly not met. And one of those is in the case of the Iraq War. And I would say, I think this is true even if you believe the overall decision was right. Even if you, and this again gets into the difference between process and substance, even if you think that the United States should have invaded Iraq and overthrown Saddam Hussein, nonetheless, the way in which the decision was made and then the aftermath of the actual invasion was to me a level of decision-making negligence that still demands accountability. It is also true, I think, this process point, even if you believe that President Bush and his senior aides were very well-intentioned. One of the interesting kind of trajectories of my thinking as I did the research for this book over a decade was my changing thinking about George W. Bush. And I ended up having great respect for him, actually, as someone who's much smarter than I think the caricature of him suggests, who has great integrity, who absolutely believed he was doing the right thing for the country. Now, he has shortcomings as a decision maker, no question. But my judgment about this is not based on a personalized judgment about George W. Bush. The fact that I think that Condoleezza Rice did not necessarily play every piece of her role as effectively as she should have is not a reflection on her as an individual. It's not a suggestion that she's an inherently malign force in American foreign policy. Looking at her record as Secretary of State, she did a number of things, I think, to bring U.S. foreign policy even more back to kind of a multilateral sensibility and sort of a level of traditionalism and effectiveness that you know, a lot of initiatives and things that happened at that time made a lot of sense. So these are not judgments about individuals as a whole. The question is, are their actions in a particular decision for war something that did not meet the standards of responsible decision making? So the reason that I think this is the case, why the Bush administration did not meet these standards, is laid out in the book. And I think we've all encountered some of this evidence over the years. Absolutely insufficient attention to the details of the intelligence being used as a basis for the war. The WMD thing is the most famous, but far from the only one. All kinds of intelligence about the nature of Iraqi society and the kind of country we would find when we got there that would have completely undermined their assumptions about the post-war phase. Particularly in terms of what they knew President Bush and Condi Rice and Colin Powell, for example, all at different times independently looked at the intelligence they were being given on WMDs and said, this isn't good enough. This isn't strong enough. This isn't enough to make a case to the American people. Where's the rest? So they had that awareness, but they didn't take the next step in saying, well, if that's my reaction, we really need to know whether this evidence is sufficient. That's just one example, but there's dozens of examples of different individuals in different places who did not do enough due diligence about the information base and particularly the intelligence being used to justify and plan the war. There was completely insufficient attention, indeed active rejection of consideration of the post-war period. This has been widely written about. I talk about this to some length in the book. But if we were going to go and seize and take control of a country of 20 to 25 million people, we needed much better understanding of what was going on there, what we were going to do, how everything was going to be coordinated. There were ample pieces of evidence in the months and weeks leading up to this war that we were not ready to do this, that the post-war phase was not put together. And those pieces of evidence were made aware to a number of senior officials, and they simply didn't do very much of them. There was a lot of buck passing. In some cases, as with Don Rumsfeld, we don't know what his thinking was. He clearly wanted to get out of Iraq very quickly, may not have thought it was that important. But that idea of post-war planning, the evidence was there to know it was a disaster and it was not acted on. There was a choice of people for key roles who were transparently inappropriate for them, people who were going to be managing the post-war phase, who were just not the right people, that reflected a level of unseriousness. There was a list at one point of all the Americans who were going to go over and become the new Secretary of Education of Iraq and Secretary of Defense of Iraq and so forth. People's names on this list who had never been contacted and were never used. Just a general level of unseriousness about thinking about who was going to staff this and how it was going to be run. There was a direct refusal to take warnings seriously. Warnings came to Rice, to Powell, to Rumsfeld, many of their subordinates, to George W. Bush himself, that the post-war phase was not put together, that this was lining up to be a disaster. There are very clear written warnings that made this clear to senior officials who did not, I would say, adequately act on those warnings to try to mitigate the risks. There was active suppression of dissent in terms of that last characteristic of making sure you promote a good discussion. That was not necessarily encouraged. I will say George W. Bush was much better at this than he sometimes gets a reputation for in terms of encouraging people to bring him what they thought was bad news or evidence that contradicted their course of action. But in general, the system got to a point where dissent was actively discouraged, where those who dissented were punished. This phrase, "you just don't get it," was used probably 100 times in response to people who expressed warnings, and that skewed the decision process. And then the overall interagency process was just not managed very well. So I think if the four criteria make sense, there's a fairly open and shut case that the senior officials of the Bush administration did not meet their duty of care to the stakeholders who would be affected by the choice to go to war. It cost over 3,000 US service members their lives, estimates of at least 250,000 Iraqi deaths. It left Iraq unstable and violence prone to this day. It cost the United States several $1 trillion that it could ill afford, massive blow to US reputation. And so we're left with the question. I mean, apart from the fact that, yes, Don Rumsfeld was forced to leave the administration a little early, there was a lot of discussion of Iraq and it affected the reputation of George W. Bush and some others. Is that enough accountability? But if we want to make this judgment, the final question is, what do we do with that impulse? What does it mean? What is the actual mechanism for holding people accountable if, as I've said, it's not a matter of sending them to jail? In very limited cases, if you have an actual violation of law, that would be appropriate, but that's just about never true in the cases we're talking about, and I'm not saying it's true in the case of Iraq. Is it just about reputation? Is it about a generalized social effort to hold people accountable? And we can say that George W. Bush's legacy as a president is fatally handicapped by the Iraq tragedy, and therefore he was held accountable. Can we say that Don Rumsfeld kind of went into a quiet retirement and hasn't been a major political or policy figure, although I think that's as much by his choice as anyone else's? Is that enough of holding somebody accountable? Is there any way to institutionalize this? One of the questions I raise in the book is, would it make sense to have some kind of a national commission whose job it was to look into the decision process of any US choice to go to war, or similarly major national security decisions, and that's a tough line to draw, investigate the decisions against some set of criteria similar to this, and make a public judgment of whether the officials met their duty of care. On the one hand, you would say, well, that's no different than any other article people are going to write making that argument. The decision makers aren't going to care. It's not going to change their long-term lives. It's not any particular legal standard. So would it really make any difference? If we can't make a difference with a mechanism like that, is there another way to do it? And what are we trying to achieve with this process? Are we trying to create a situation where, for example, the officials now going into the Biden administration are thinking to themselves, I have to look over my shoulder because I have to be careful about what I put down on paper? Or in a more positive sense, are we trying to create an environment where senior officials are aware of a common set of standards of what it means to run a decision process for war in a way that satisfies a duty of care? Now, the thing is, these are experienced people. They already have in their minds what that would look like. Would it make any difference? Would it help to have a more agreed national standard of what we're going to be looking for when we look at their record afterward? These are tough questions, and in no way am I saying that there's an obvious answer. I do think at least two things. I think, first of all, that it is critically important for a democracy to have a sense that senior officials making the most consequential, arguably, decisions that a nation makes in terms of going to war are held accountable to some standards in the way that they make those decisions. And I think, secondly, that there are at least limited ways of making some progress in more formally and publicly establishing that kind of a process. But again, there's a lot of landmines on the way, and it's very difficult. So I'll stop there and take any questions.
Thanks so much, Michael. Can you hear me? Just checking.
Yes.
Great. Michael, that was fabulous and really good. Great to get those insights with you honing in on this idea of policy negligence and accountability. And I'd like to stick with that just for a moment, because one of the things that seems to me, there seem to be two big factors in your book around the decision-making process. One is the kind of strategic personality of American foreign policy making more broadly, and we might get to that in a second. The other is this idea of individual agency and how individuals within the system operate and interact with each other. And it is striking in the way that you describe the many conversations that happen or that happened in the lead up to America going into Iraq, that there was kind of a tumbling process through all of this. There was no specific decision-making moment, and certainly limited contestability in this process. And I guess I'm interested, as someone who spends a bit of time with policymakers here in Canberra, and we talk a lot about, how do you contest decisions? What does it take? There seems to me to be a leadership issue here as well for policymakers. And I wonder if you can just speak to that. What does it take to exercise leadership in a system that almost seems to have predetermined what it's going to do? How do you contest decisions effectively?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think part of the issue is that the first requirement of leadership from the top is to create an environment in which people don't necessarily think that the system has already decided what it's going to do. Because I think you're absolutely right that very quickly after 9/11, the American system decided that, or it was fairly quickly in some areas, and then gradually the awareness came to others that this was going to happen. And the most famous example of that is about June of the following year, when the head of policy planning, Richard Haass, went to Condoleezza Rice and said, hey, I'm hearing a lot of talk about war. We need to think about that a little more carefully before we do it. And she said, oh, Richard, that decision's been made. Yeah. And if the head of policy planning at the State Department didn't even know it, that suggests that maybe the process wasn't as clear as it should have been. But that's the first challenge, is for a president, a prime minister, the head of government and some very senior officials to create an environment where, now it's easier said than done, as you know, because this is typically not going to be a situation where, I mean, for one thing, these people don't come to these jobs because they want to get there and just start asking everybody what to do. They already have very particular ideas of what the right kind of policies are. And so they're going to have a pretty fixed idea of what to do and not necessarily believe that, well, we need a big open debate. And then in some cases, if you're talking about going to war, major national security decisions, there'll be a sense that they have to actually avoid an open debate before doing that. I mean, President Obama, I think, should get praise for the extended debate he had about the Afghan surge, but at the time, he certainly got a lot of criticism. He was dragging this out, it was too public, and all the rest. So I think what your question gets to is it's extraordinarily difficult to meet these criteria in some cases in the national security side, given the realities of the nature of the people involved and the way decisions are made. But it is not impossible. We have plenty of cases on the other side of the ledger, as I'm sure you could identify in the Australian case. In the U.S. case, I think there's, although the outcome was imperfect, the Obama Afghan decision met the criteria that I'm talking about. It clearly did meet them. You can still disagree with the decision. And I was actually in government at the time, and what finally came out was kind of an amalgam of a lot of ideas that had been floating around that hadn't really been put together before then. But the process, I think they satisfied their duty of care to the stakeholders in that decision in the way they went around the process. President Eisenhower, there's some cases of intervening or not in Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and the general Indochina debate he was making. There's other choices like that, I think, where you can point to and say the way that they conducted themselves as senior officials clearly did meet their duty of care. And that to me is the fundamental contrast is between those kind of cases and cases like this where they clearly did not. And sort of the question I'm asking is, well, then what do you do about that? To me, it's not necessarily enough to sort of just say, well, that was too bad, we'll now walk away from it.
Yeah, I know we've got questions coming in from the audience, and I'll get to those in just a second. But another question for you, it did seem striking that the media were almost absent in some of that commentary or critical analysis of the decision-making process. I wonder if you can speak to that a little.
That's a very good point. And actually, when I finished this, I felt like a whole separate book could have been written about the failure of the American media during this process. There was a famous article by James Fallows called The 51st State that appeared in the Atlantic. And apart from that, and there were a bunch of little articles about, there's some debates about what happens when we get there in the post-war. But in terms of real, hard, tough, rigorous assessment of, do they know what they're doing? Are they ready for it? Some of the interviews I started were 2004, 2005, that long ago. And, the media could have known about a lot of stuff that came out later in terms of the fact that we were in the process of not meeting some of these criteria.
Yeah.
And it didn't get out. The pressures of we're going to war, they don't want to be, all these different kinds of things. And in some cases, they actively, with the New York Times and WMD were part of the problem. So yeah, so like another possible response would be, how do we set up established media components that can be relied upon to ask those hard questions in the way that the major papers and networks might not? And obviously some of that's going on now, but that could be another avenue to accountability. Yes.
Yeah, and hot tip for any students or hopeful PhD students, I think Michael's just given you an idea on a possible topic to pick up on how we find those good media points to support an accountability process. One more for me, because here in Australia, of course, we have discussions about what it means to be an ally of the United States. And certainly there was significant criticism around Australia's decision to join the Coalition of the Willing. I was just reading an article the other day where, it was quoting our Prime Minister, John Howard, at the time, who talked about the fact that, following 9/11, The events of 9/11 really necessitated a 100% ally, not a 70%, not an 80% ally, which I think also meant for us there was a failure of critical analysis or contesting the decision on Iraq. I know you didn't specifically look necessarily, but I think your book has lessons for allies of the United States as well. You know, was that something that crossed your mind as you were writing?
So I talked a little bit in there because so many of the British documents had been released as part of their Iraq War commission, talked more about their case and similarities to yours. And you know, Tony Blair essentially is offered a chance, right, by George Bush, where he's told, you know, if this is going to destroy you politically, I can do without you. And his answer is similar, which is an ally is an ally, and we've got to be in with you. I don't know if I don't necessarily have a problem with that as a principle, but to me what it does is again magnifies the duty of care that the leader of that coalition has, because they have it to their coalition partners and indeed the citizens of their country and indeed the members of their militaries, right? And I think part of the fury with the United States is out of this case is we asked and in some cases demanded people to go along, and then they find out later the poor quality by which we made the decision that drew them into a years long, you know, occupation and all the other things that they ended up paying for in part because of our poor decision making. So that's another reason why I think that accountability is just so critical to legitimacy and to the U.S. international position as well.
Indeed, to a soft power profile.
Right. Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Now let's get to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, and we've got one that asks about the evaluation. Where does a failure to act fall within the framework for evaluating?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I would say since the thing I'm focusing on, and you could make a case for a substantively based criteria, but what I'm focused on is process. I don't know that it would be that different. So like, for example, the Rwanda thing, right, is a famous case of inaction, which Samantha Power and others later argued was a terrible tragedy and misjudgment. So the question would be, in the process of making that choice, did they meet certain criteria, whether the four I'm suggesting or some related set? And, you know, I think it's interesting that her case study of that decision is not as much about the fact that the process was completely flawed as much as that she didn't like the outcome. I think it is, from what I know of that case, it's possible to make an argument that the process was adequate to meet certain criteria, that they didn't fail on any of these cases. So basically, I think the fundamental answer is, if you're looking at process, and does a national security advisor fulfill their duty of care, and Secretary of State, Defense, so on, by playing their role effectively, managing a process, giving their best advice to the president and so forth, whatever elements of their role that are critical. And if they meet these various criteria and really are trying to do it rigorously, then whether they decide to act or not, they've met the criteria.
In some ways, you know, there's enormous benefit of thinking about the process rather than, I know so many policymakers get very caught up in the substance, the content, making the right decision. But in fact, you know, if you follow the right, there will always be imperfections in a decision-making process. But if you've got a process in place, I guess.
Right. But as you know, practitioners are very resistant to process arguments, in part because they don't want to be hamstrung by a process, because they're there because they're absorbing information and making their judgment, which is true to a degree. And also because I think they know that, you know, process is not obviously a magic wand either. You could have a great process and still make a bad decision. But to me, the Iraq case is a great example of how a really bad process will ruin you every time. And at a minimum, there are certain minimum standards you need to meet. And but yeah, it is a tough argument to make. I've had many of these discussions, and even with some of my interviewees, talking to them about, well, couldn't we have done this or that? And they sort of, you know, the president's going to think what he's going to think, and it's all going to flow down from there. And you could have a wonderful process, and it wouldn't have changed it. But I think process plus people who are playing their role as they should, who are willing, you know, and George Shultz just passed. I was lucky enough to have a chance to work with him in the study program on disarmament that he ran out of the Hoover Institution for a number of years. And he's a great example of somebody who played his role in the sense of when he really saw something happening that was unacceptable, he would tell a president or go into a president and say, well, maybe you don't need me anymore because this is the way it should be. I mean, the famous case people are talking about the last few days is when Nixon tried to get him to use the IRS to spy on their enemies, and he said, I'm not going to do that. That's not what the IRS is for. Not that there was anything that obvious in the Iraq case, but senior officials who have enough independence of standing and judgment and a willingness to stand up for the rigor of the decision over their own position in the system, plus good process, get you good outcomes. And again, we've seen that in, you know, like the first Bush administration, I think is a reasonable facsimile of some aspects of that on decisions like handling German unification. But that combination is what we need. And I think complementing it can be some expanded public sense of, and if you don't meet those criteria, you have to be held accountable in some way.
Yeah, and actually the next question is somewhat related, talking about Congress. Congress often uses investigations of administration actions if controlled by the opposition party. Do you think they are useful in this process or have any effect?
So that's another book that could have been written out of this, is the failure of Congress. As we know, the United States Congress approved the resolution effectively for war with Iraq with much higher majorities than it approved the 1990-91 resolution to fight the Gulf War, which I think is not shocking given 9/11, you know, and its effect on the country, but it still is a little head scratching. There are, as we know, a lot of Democrats who voted for it who regret that decision, but who were swept up in the sense of patriotism and the need to support the president and all the rest of it. So yes, absolutely. The role of Congress is another question to ask. And is there room for a formal, probably establishing an entire committee goes too far, but is there room for some process within the armed services committees, for example, or foreign affairs and foreign relations committees, whereby when the nation is considering going to war, it automatically triggers some kind of investigatory process in advance to try to identify for members of Congress whether, but I mean, you know, part of the thing is it's all about the appetite, because some of these senior senators and House members could have known a lot more than they did about how well or badly this was going to go. They just, you know, as you say, it's deference to the executive branch to a certain degree, and there's a sense that, okay, when it's war making, it's their decision to make, and they can ask our permission, but it's not for us to get too closely involved. I think one big lesson out of Iraq is in a democracy, we've gotten to a point where the executive branch is too much of an independent operator on war making, and that the media, as you say, the Congress, the wider national security community, the American people, both before and then after, in an analytical sense, need to be more annoying and poke themselves into the process of what's going on and determine whether these criteria are being met.
And you've taken us beautifully to our next question around the issue of general public audiences. And if the American people aren't directly affected by foreign policy actions, so for example, in the case of Iraq, no draft, no war tax, it would seem that ultimate accountability would require some kind of mechanism to ensure the electorate has some skin in the game. What are your thoughts on that?
So it is interesting. I think that there's two overlapping ideas here. One is about specific accountability for national security teams and senior officials, and the other is about the constraints that you put in the way of war making. And I think this question gets more to the second, really, which is, and I agree with that, I think it's become too easy. And again, George W. Bush absolutely thought he was doing the right thing for the country. in making this choice. And presidents who make national security decisions, basically, I think just about, some recent examples possibly apart, think they are doing the best thing for the country. So it's not a matter of saying that they're malign individuals, but in a democracy, I think we've learned that it is just perilous to have effectively one person having that choice to themselves without even really having any significant checks or balances. I think that's the lesson of the Iraq case. So I don't agree with a draft. I think that there would be ways of creating, as we were talking about a minute ago, more of an expanded congressional role that really mandates a more significant investigation. You know, part of the problem with the Iraq case is it's a little bit of an outlier because of the effects of 9/11, right? That just put the mood of that administration and the American people in a different place. And if they'd gone without 9/11 and asked for permission to go to war in Iraq, clearly they would have been told no, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so given that, and so that's one of the problems of this case is that you have this national bloodlust that means that almost any barriers you try to put in the way of war, you know, this is going to be pushing against them. But anyway, I agree with the thrust of the question. I think there are ways to do this. I would not say, because I don't think a draft in and of itself makes a difference. And I wouldn't want to put that obligation on young people just to do something we could achieve in other ways.
We only have a few minutes left, Michael, but I wonder if we can fast forward in a way to the current day. You know, it's a very different geopolitical, geostrategic environment. We have a new American administration under President Biden, but the world is going through some fairly consequential shifts in power, and we have a strategic rivalry between the United States and China, for example. I wonder if you can think about some of the lessons coming out of your book, what you gained, the insights you gained, and how well prepared is the national security community now in America to make some really big decisions on their future role, their role in America's role in our region, the Asia Pacific as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the incoming team is extraordinarily well prepared. You know, it's a group of people who are, I think in all the cases that we've seen so far, being chosen for true expertise in their field, whatever job they're going to have. Just about all of them have government experience, which from a process standpoint will help it, you know, run well. So, I have nothing but sort of positive feelings about the team. I think there are two broader questions, which your question kind of gets to, that the Iraq case raises, which, and as I try to stress with that, even, you know, looking beyond, and I've been criticized for not blaming George Bush and some of his officials enough for being evildoers. But I think that the real issues are beyond personalities. They're beyond, you know, the quality of whether you think the Secretary of State is a brilliant and experienced person. And the couple of issues, one is the recurring and broader tendency, sort of in some of the phrases you were using, of sort of momentum of thinking in the national security community, which means that even when you have great people, they are still to some extent a prisoner of, you know, the socially constructed ideas that are that are guiding the system. And that's one of the reasons for the great importance of this fourth criterion, in the sense of creating a process that is really open to a lot of different opinions and that forces itself to try to question established assumptions. That's a problem for every large organization, certainly every administration. And I'll be interested to see if this administration ends up trying to take some specific actions, procedural things, initiatives to counteract that. And then the second broad problem, I think, that your question gets to is beyond the procedure of making decisions, to the fact that the United States now confronts a foreign policy and national security challenge that it has never had in the history of the country. That is, it has to still be, I think, the first among equals leader of the international community at a time of really true multipolarity. So you had multipolarity in periods where the United States was not the leader, and then the United States has led in a period of bipolarity and unipolarity, and now there is sort of a fundamental bipolarity with China, but all these other players are, very significant catalytic and middle powers that have to be worked with. And many of them, as we know in this region, share a lot of values with the United States, share some interests, but may not share the American appetite for a certain approach to China, or be willing to allow the United States to do certain things it wants to do. So we need sort of a reformulated basic conception of how we're going about our national security strategy, and that debate is underway, but I think even after a number of years, it remains in a very embryonic state. And I'm a little concerned that it's rushing to the extremes a bit in the debate between the so-called restrainers and the kind of either primicists or traditionalists, and there's this wide range of space for interesting and innovative ideas in between that is only intermittently tapped. So those are the things I'm more worried about than any particular individuals. It doesn't rule out the fact that we might be talking about accountability for some tragedy from this administration. I think it's a lot less likely. I would not bet on it. But it establishes certainly the wider context, I think, that your question got to.
And I think we all look forward to seeing some of that discussion unfold, and certainly the discussion around America's sense of leadership, that strategic personality, and how that will look to play a role, how the US will look to play a role in our region. So, Michael, thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I can see that your book is going to have, it's an incredible book. You must have spent an enormous amount of time speaking to people, reading through documents. You mentioned this was a decade-long process for you. What's next?
So at the moment, working on, in my RAND work, we're doing a lot of work on trying to rethink aspects of U.S. military strategy, U.S. posture, these kind of questions for our clients. And then I'm not working on another book at the moment, but with my friend Patrick Porter, trying to think about the U.S. policy toward Taiwan going forward, and how we find exactly that sort of rich middle ground on that issue, which I think is potentially one of the most dangerous things we have to navigate over the coming years, and where, if we don't get the decision-making process right, we might, and this is not about the current administration, it's just about the United States trying to manage this, we could end up with a tragedy that's even more devastating than Iraq. So that's something that I think we need a lot more innovative thinking about in the United States.
Well, I hope we can keep connected with you, and it's been fabulous to talk to you virtually. I hope you're able to maybe come out to Australia at some stage as well and share a little more from your learnings. I think we've got an enormous amount to learn from you. And for those in the audience, I know Stacey would have put a link to the book as well. It's a great read, really compelling. So thank you, Michael. Thanks for spending some time with us, and I'll hand back over to Stacey.
Thank you.